Well, welcome everyone. Good to see you. We're going to concentrate today on one aspect of the ministry and life of Francis Schaeffer. And I'll begin with a rather personal introduction, not because I enjoy talking about me, I don't, but because it might give you a window onto the experience of L'Abri in the early days, which I think helps to explain the impact of this ministry. And then we'll focus in on his views of the Christian life, particularly. I'm not going to talk much about his apologetics. I love interruptions of the right kind, so please, if something's not clear or you want to say something in the middle, that's great. And then I'll leave time here and there for questions. So, I was a 18 or 19-year-old at university. I was at Harvard, and I grew up in a wonderful family that was nevertheless not evangelical in any sense of the word. My mom did drag us to Sunday school in the Episcopal Church, so I knew some prayers and things, but it wasn't at all clear to me. I grew up in Paris. My dad was a businessman there, and I grew up as a typical kid and then young man, loving French literature and loving soccer, football, and especially loving music, and all the while searching for truth, I guess. I was sent to a boarding school in New England, modeled after the British public schools. 200 boys, all cooped up, lots of rules. Some of it, we had some very marvelous teachers, including the chaplain, who was a very good man. And then we had some very perverted ideas about life as young boys. So I decided to go into music, and at Harvard at the time, they had a curriculum design which was based on a couple of remarkable scholars who came into prominence after the war. One of them was at Harvard, and from whom I took a course. His name was John Finley. And they thought Americans were going to have some leadership role in the world, which many Americans had been reluctant to have. And in order to do that, they felt that Americans should be better educated than they tended to be. And so we were all required to take courses outside of our immediate discipline. And so I chose a course that was really popular, checked with some friends, and this is the one to take. It was called Humanities 2, and it was a great sweeping survey of epics and drama from the early Greeks up to the moderns, the theater of the absurd and so on. And the lecturer was this brilliant man, John Finley, and it was way before the days of all of this, and so he had a mic that he carried, and it was a long cord, and he pranced up and down the stage, and we were always hoping he'd kind of trip himself up, but he never did. And then the course was divided into small sections, which was a way to manage the large number of students. And I had a section of maybe 12, maybe 15. And my section instructor was a graduate student in history with the unusual name of Harold O.J. Brown. And he walked into the room the first time, the last of the stiff collars, and he had a briefcase with HOJB on it, and he had a very deep voice. And we thought, this is going to be challenging. He's some sort of relic from somewhere. But he turned out to be anything but a relic, and he presented the course with great clarity. He was a brilliant man, knew 10 or 12 languages, and got us deeply into the material. And he announced himself pretty soon into the course as an evangelical Christian. And none of us knew what that was. We didn't have any prejudice for it or against it. We thought, okay, how strange and interesting. And he gradually wove into the class a Christian, I would say, comparison, if not critique, of some of the authors we were studying, from Aeschylus to Dante and on to Beckett and others. And he kept talking about the Christian worldview in contrast to these other worldviews. And the Greek worldview had a closed universe but it was manipulated by the fates and the gods. And the modern worldview was even more closed because there was nobody there. But in the Christian worldview, there was a God who has created and given us freedom, and I was totally enraptured with this. I had never heard anything remotely like it. And I was searching, and so we became friends. His name was Joe, Harold O.J. Brown. Joe and I, went out for late night drinks often and went to his home. And now, with perspective, I realized he was working on me. But at the time, I thought he was just being a good friend. And in one of our last meetings in the spring, he said, I would really like you to meet a friend of mine. And I was going back to Switzerland with my brother. We were traveling in Europe that summer. And he scratched out the name Francis A. Schaeffer and then put a telephone number and gave it to me. So I put it away somewhere. And we were traveling through Europe on a bicycle and having a great time. And then we ended up in Zurich. And my brother wanted to go home. This is about maybe mid to late July. And I wanted to stay a little longer. And so I thought, well, I'll take out this piece of paper and call this man that Joe wants me to meet. So I phoned, and this was the 60s. This was adventure. We were good for this. And I got Edith Schaeffer on the phone, and she couldn't have been nicer. And she said, "Oh, Bill, Edgar, we've heard about you. You have." And she said, so I said, "Can I come and have tea with you?" "Oh, no," she said, "you must come and spend the weekend." I thought, my, this is a very generous and unusual family. So I hopped the train, sold the bicycle, put my backpack on, went to Lausanne, and then you have to stop in Aigle, and then go to Olon, and then take the very scary mail bus who has a knob on his wheel going around the curves and nothing to guard you from the edge, high up into the Swiss Alps. And I was told to ask the driver to stop at Huemoz, H-U-E-M-O-Z. So I told the driver to stop at Huemoz, and he did, and I got out, and there was a nice Dutch woman who greeted me, and within a few minutes, she said, she welcomed me, and it was very warm and all, and she said, "Are you a Christian?" I said, "Oh, that's an ambiguous question." And she said, "No, you've just given me an ambiguous answer." Then they, apparently we were having a bigger than usual meal the next day, which was Sunday. And would I go into the living room and help take peas out of their pods? Oh, sure, that sounded fine. I could manage that with my Harvard education. And so, we passed these beans around in these brown bags, and we took them out of the pods. But in the background was a tape of what I thought was a woman, a very learned woman, speaking about existentialism. Now, this was a big test for me because I fancied myself an existentialist, and I loved Camus. I read Sartre through and through, didn't like him as much. But, I knew a thing or two about it. And so this woman, talked about existentialism, got it pretty well right. One place where I struggled was she called Kierkegaard the father of both secular and religious existentialism. And I had decided that I disagreed with that, but I was willing to listen because it was very, very learned. So I had this great lecture. And by the time the peas were out of their pods, the lecture was over. And I turned to my neighbor and said, who is this? And they said, "It's Francis Schaeffer." And so, sure enough, he had a very high-pitched voice. And the tape recorders in those days made it even more shrill. Then I said, "Pretty good," and they showed me to my, where I was going to live and got rid of my stuff, and we had a cookout, which I learned later that they would have every Saturday night. And I met the most extraordinary people from every country in the world. Some of them seemed to know about this evangelical Christianity, and others didn't know much, and we just talked, and then it was time for what they called the discussion group. So we were invited back into the living room where I'd listened to this tape, and they'd cleared the place, and there were some chairs around, and most people just sat cross-legged on the floor. And in a few minutes, this wonderful man walked in the room, Francis Schaeffer, and he paused over me, and he said, "Welcome." So I think Joe had pretty much told him I was coming and needed some help. And So then he sat down on this wonderful barrel with a red top that Edith had actually made for him, and that's where he held forth every time he did. And in characteristic fashion, with a whole lot of students in the room, mostly students, there were a few older people, he said, "Yes, well, then, where shall we begin?" That was his way. "Yes, well, then, where shall we begin?" So there was a pause, and then somebody raised his hand and asked a question about prayer. They call this a discussion, but you usually got about a 30-second question and a 30-minute answer. He started talking about prayer. I had never heard anybody remotely articulate about prayer. I knew my little prayers from the prayer book, but he talked about, how it's a conversation with God and how God answers you. And he told this story, which is now, I think, a famous story about Francis Schaeffer. He was taking the plane from America, or maybe back home to Europe on an old DC-9 or something, and the props feathered, and the plane just started going directly down to the waves, and about 2 or 3 feet from crashing, they suddenly ignited, and it started to take off again. And Schaeffer, after they got safely wherever it was, he told the pilot, "Thank you very much." And the pilot said, "I honestly don't know what happened." And Schaeffer said, "Well, I honestly do. I was praying, and then my family had heard on the radio there was a plane in trouble, and they were praying. And there was a sort of prayer triangle, and God heard, and he answered." And the pilot sort of shook his head, and off Schaeffer went. And, I was just bewildered and fascinated by these stories of answered prayer. Anyway, the evening went on quite late. And after the evening was over, he got up and he came over to me and he said, "I'm not preaching tomorrow." I said, "Okay. That means I'll have energy, and I'd love to have a conversation with you." And I said, "That would be wonderful." He said, "Try to think of a question that you have, and we'll explore that." So that night I tried to wrestle with some question. I'm ashamed to say I came up with something really brilliant, like, why is Christianity relevant? Something like that. And but the next morning, sure enough, we had this wonderful church service. Again, I'd never seen anything like it. Church for me was Gothic structures and kneeling and saying the creed, and instead it was all sitting around again, cross-legged. And the first part of the service was singing Bach chorales, so in parts. And as a music student, I thought, now this is the church for me. And everyone couldn't have been warmer. And they had a long period of prayer where they seemed to believe that if there weren't a God listening, these would be not just irrelevant, but absurd. And they really meant what they prayed about. And then there was an hour-and-a-half sermon by the wonderful Randall Macaulay, who preached in his family kilt. And he preached, I still remember it, on reconciling Paul and James on the issue of justification and works. In one level, I had no idea what he was worried about and what they were preaching about, but at another level, it was so engaging. And I was just intrigued. And at the end, he showed us how the two could be reconciled, and, amen. And so then we got up, and I went up to stairs where Dr. Schaeffer used to counsel people, and sat down with him. And he had, books all around, art books. He loved the arts. And then he started, and he said, "Yes, well, then, where shall we begin?" And I asked him my question, how do you know it's relevant, even if it's true? Of course, he was loving that question. And he just took off for about 45 minutes, and including the free will argument defense for the problem of evil, and all kinds of things about the significance of man, and if it isn't true, then everything is hopeless. And I thought, yes, and he went on, and we spoke for a couple of hours, and at the end of which, I was a believer. It was just true. And if it's possible to know, when the Holy Spirit comes into your life, I did. Not everybody has that. And so then he said, well, something like, welcome into the family, and I think we should pray together. Okay, let's pray together. Why don't you pray? No, I'd like you to pray. So I said, well, what do I say? Well, he said, saying thank you to God would do very nicely. And so I mumbled something about thanks, and then we prayed for Joe Brown and Harvard University, and it was just unbelievable. So then as we got up, I asked him if there was any way I could stay for a while, and he sort of shook his head. He said, we're really full at this moment. We have about 30 people. Little did he know that 10 years later, the Swiss government would have to cap the whole thing at 130. But this was before the books, before the movies, before, all of that. And so he said, we'll find room for you. Come on back. And I had to go do some errands, and then a couple of days later, I came back, and I had a tutor who guided me through all of his basic Bible studies, the series on Romans, and the one that was the most important, he thought, for me, besides the basic Christian stuff, was one he called the Intellectual Climate and the New Theology, which became kind of the basis of his first major book, The God Who Was There. And so I came back to Harvard as a believing Christian, and made all the mistakes zealous new Christians do. I blew it with my parents. A couple of my new friends, because I didn't have any Christian friends, but I made them fast. So we decided to test this out by marching into the divinity school at Harvard and asking them irrefutable questions. And of course, they'd heard all of this before, and they were easy to refute. But at any rate, I was a new Christian with all this zeal, and we invited Francis Schaeffer to come and speak at Harvard, and he did, and it was absolutely electrifying. He filled a place called Lowell Lecture Hall, which is an enormous lecture hall, to the brim, and he spoke about the intellectual climate using his illustration of the line of despair, before which people more or less accepted absolutes, after which they were willing to leap into the dark and become relativists. Now, some of this was not as careful in a scholarly way, and I spent my life in the academy, and I've seen little problems here and there, but what was important was that the excitement about comparing the Christian worldview to these many other worldviews, and he had carefully read many of the same people I had and found things about them that I never had, and it was just powerful. And I dragged my non-Christian friends into the place, and they were pretty astonished, And I'll give you one more incident, and then we'll talk a little bit more about Francis Schaeffer, his history, and then the Christian life thing. We lived in houses. That's the way the college was set up, much as you'd have colleges at Oxford or Cambridge. They were called houses at Harvard. And I was in Kirkland House, and we had a private dining room. And when the next time he came, I invited him to have dinner with us in this private dining room, along with about 10 or 12 of my dearest friends, most of them Jewish. I was very attracted to Jewish people, still am. And they were bright, artistic, and involved in leadership, and most of them not anti-religion, not maybe atheistic, but just totally indifferent. Secular Jews and non-practicing people. So we gathered together, and Schaeffer was a little late, and I was getting a little nervous about this because I'd built him up, pretty well. So he finally arrived, and we sat down and we started to eat, and I introduced Dr. Schaeffer as a person who believes in the Bible, that he believes it's true. I wasn't sure how else to introduce it. Well, that got everybody's attention, and so they started going back and forth, and they started asking questions. I remember one of them, a friend of mine who had studied Buddhism, and he was asking Schaeffer the difference between Theravada and Minhayana Buddhism, and on which one was closer to the truth as he saw it. I thought, oh, no, Schaeffer hasn't studied this stuff. He's not conversant with it, Well, he went into this amazing story. He had read somewhere that thousands of years ago in the Indus Valley, all these tradespeople came together, and one of the results was a syncretistic religion that soon became Hindu pantheism. And the language reflected it and everything else. How did you know this stuff? And he probably hadn't ever thought about Theravada Buddhism, but he had read this article and he brought out this thing, and my friend was totally astonished. Oh, yes, right. And he gave him a platform to talk about pantheism and to compare it to Christianity. And it was brilliant. He had this sort of nose for the issue behind the issue. And the other one I remember from a very dear friend who was studying in city planning, which was a burgeoning department. And he was very excited because this is the early 60s. They were beginning to invent these machines that were to be called computers. And the machine was going to fix city planning in lots of ways. And he explained all this to Francis Schaeffer. He said, well, what does this have to do with your Christian faith? And Schaeffer said, he looked at him and he said, that's all fine, but what's the place of man in all of this? Where is humanity? I was like, yeah, I never thought about that. You know, this was the kind of evening we had. He had this amazing sense of how to get behind the question to some of the issues that everyone faces, and he did it very comfortably. And so, of course, they all wanted to be his friend. They asked him to read their papers, and you know, just had this unbelievable impact. Well, where did Francis Schaeffer come from, and how did he arrive at this place where he could be so conversant with the issues of life? You may have read the Labrie story or Edith's The Tapestry. You get a good sense of this. I love the little biography by Colin Duryea, who shows all of this. Perhaps the definitive biography has yet to be written, but the essence of it is that he grew up in Germantown, Philadelphia, right where we live, just a few, you know, not even a mile away from where we live. And his grandparents had immigrated. They were working class people. And though his father was a pretty tough character and probably not a believer at this point, he wanted his children to go to church, so they went to the liberal Presbyterian church, and Fran was kind of interested, but he thought this is not working. So he bought himself a Bible to sort of be fair about what Christianity was before he threw it away. Started reading. The more he read, the more he said, this is true, and this does not fit what I'm hearing from the pulpit. So he became a believer. There were other factors. He married Edith, went to seminary. I'm condensing a lot here. And then he was at Westminster Seminary because Edith had urged him to go there. She had loved J. Gresham Machen, who was an outstanding scholar and one of the strong voices against what they used to call modernism at the time. And he taught at Westminster. And so he went there and he studied with Cornelius Van Til and all these marvelous people. But there was a group in the student body, as well as 2 or 3 professors, that were quite unhappy with what they considered Westminster's coldness and its unwillingness to see that the only interpretation of Revelation 20 that is legitimate is that there would be a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ before the second coming. And they also were alarmed that Westminster had not taken a position to abstain from the so-called liberties, dancing, cards, gambling, cards are gambling, drinking, theater, there's one other, smoking. So one thing led to another, and they got up and left following a fiery Presbyterian minister who would be a minister named Carl McIntyre. And they formed their own denomination in their own seminary. And it was called The Movement. And Schaeffer finished seminary at this other seminary and then got ordained and was the first minister in the new Bible Presbyterian church. And they sent him to Pittsburgh, to St. Louis, and then to Delaware to take parishes. And he was a very effective minister. They loved children. He had a strong sense that children should be reached for the Lord, and Edith was a pioneer in the flannel graph, and they had Empire Boys Clubs and Empire Girls Clubs. But Schaeffer increasingly had a burden to warn some of the European churches about the dangers of neo-orthodoxy on the one hand and liberalism on the other hand. And there's a lot of reasons for that. He loved the arts. He had a very strong concern for Jewish people and particularly for what was happening to them under Nazi threat. And so many things drew him to Europe. He persuaded the mission to send him to Europe on an exploratory trip, and they did, and he went, and he came back totally enthusiastic for the work that needed to be done over there. Long story short, they moved over to Europe, and Fran took up residence in Switzerland, from which he could travel mostly by train all over Europe and up to Great Britain, ministering to churches and particularly warning their Sunday school leaders and some of their other leaders about the twin dangers of neo-orthodoxy and liberalism. But at the same time, he would spend as much time as he could in art museums. He loved music. He was very culturally aware, and he was kind of self-taught, but he knew enormous amounts about both the visual and the musical arts. That, of course, as you would know, became a big part of his apologetics. He made friends with Hans Rookmacher in Amsterdam, talking about jazz and looking at museums, and they became best friends and collaborators. And Hans Rookie, we called him, he founded the Dutch Labrie. At any rate, a thing happened that triggered a desperate crisis in Francis Schaeffer's life. We don't know all the reasons for it, but in the early 50s, there he was in Switzerland, warning all these churches about liberalism, but he sensed an increasing coldness. He sensed that the zeal and enthusiasm that he once knew was waxing very dim. And one incident that I think had a lot to do with triggering this crisis that he went into was he was concerned about neo-orthodoxy to the point where he got an appointment with Karl Barth, who was the pioneer of crisis theology or dialectical theology. Americans call it neo-orthodoxy. And he went and had I think a fairly cordial discussion with Karl Barth and asked him a lot of questions. And then he went home and wrote a paper which he was going to read at some church convention somewhere. And to be sure that he'd gotten everything right, he sent the paper to Karl Barth and asked if he could have another appointment. And he got a stinging letter back, absolutely critical of Schaeffer. He says, "You don't really want to talk to me. You've already decided that I'm guilty. You don't want to do theology. You want to do criminology." And the letter goes downhill from there. Now, Schaeffer always stuck to his guns about the flaws of neo-orthodoxy, but this has got to have stung him pretty badly, because he considered himself someone who's open to conversation and who is at least interesting to talk to. And Karl Barth said, "I don't want to see you. You've already condemned me as a heretic. What's the point?" And so he went into a tailspin. And for a number of weeks, even months, he told Edith, "I have to rethink the whole matter of Christianity. I have to go back to the basics and decide whether my first decision was right." So for weeks he paced in the Swiss Alps, and when it was raining he paced in the big hayloft they had. And he rethought the whole matter of Christianity. I felt, for Edith in all of this, because she knew that if he came to the conclusion Christianity was false, he would throw it all overboard, and she'd have a tremendous problem on her hands. He emerged at the end, concluding that it was true, and he says, "I started I was so happy to conclude this, and I had the joy back, and I wrote poetry. He said it wasn't very good poetry, but I was pretty excited. And then they decided that the movement had been guilty of being right in doctrine, but wrong in lack of love. And so they left the movement. And long story short, about the founding of L'Abri, they had to leave their home in the canton of where they were in the Valais, which was Catholic, because they'd had a religious influence on the city. And they were allowed to relocate by Swiss law as long as they could purchase property in a Protestant canton. And through a lot of miraculous adventures, they moved to the neighboring canton de Vaud in the little village of Weymouth. And that's where they began to realize they had a special ministry to students. Their eldest daughter, Priscilla, was at the university, brought friends up every weekend, and he was able to just answer their questions. And that's the beginning of these discussions that I had experienced, which was, I guess, 8 or 9 years into the history of L'Abri. And he developed a method of apologetics which was informed by what he learned at seminary, but also his love for the arts, also his doctrinal convictions with love. And so he has a sort of hybrid apologetics. He called himself a presuppositionalist, and I think there are elements of that, but it was a wonderfully eclectic. Brian Follis has written a very good book on his apologetics, Truth with Love. But again, the definitive work, I think, is yet to be written. And so this crisis, which was resolved by God's grace, resulted in his work on the Christian life. And he resolved to look again at what he called the present value of the shed blood of Christ. And so he wrote a book that's the result of a lot of preaching and a lot of thinking about true spirituality. And for my money, it's a great classic, and it's, as Schaeffer himself says, it is what is written in these pages that explains the ministry and the effectiveness of L'Abri, with all the insightful apologetics, with all the books and the films and the lectures. He felt that what was the foundation of his work was his rediscovery of the present value of the shed blood of Christ. So if you've read the book, you know it's divided very simply into two sections: freedom from the bonds of sin, and then freedom from the present power of the bonds of sin. And it has 14 or 15 chapters in which he explores freedom. Several of the themes that emerge, I think, were very helpful to the church at that time. One of Schaeffer's greatest emphases is reality. He used that word all the time. And this book, True Spirituality, is partly the result of his sensing a lack of reality, which plunged him into the crisis, and from which he reemerged with a greater sense of reality. And what he means by reality is the sense or the understanding of the actual truth, power, and reality of God's work. The invisible world is as real as the visible world. Just because we can't see it doesn't mean it isn't as effective. You may know his famous illustration where he says, imagine we have a universe and there's two chairs. There's what he calls the chair of unfaith and the chair of faith. Now, even believers can occupy the chair of unfaith, which is when you sit and you don't see the reality of the supernatural. You act and operate as though it made no difference. He woke up one morning, apparently, and said to Edith, "What if today we looked at our Bibles and they had been changed? Not, as he always put it, as the liberals would demythologize it, but really changed by God himself. And all the verses about the Holy Spirit and prayer were removed, surgically removed. What practical difference would it make in our lives today? And he concluded, precious little. So they resolved to engage in the reality of prayer big time. When we were at L'Abri, there was prayer all the time. Monday was a day of prayer, long prayers throughout the day. The most difficult ones for me were at lunch when you were hungry. You'd worked all morning, and you had this wonderful food in front of you, and it was wafting its aroma. And somebody would pray beginning at Genesis and ending at Revelation, and include the cosmos and the angels. And anyway, but they were really, really serious about prayer, and they had amazing stories about answered prayers, like the airplane thing, but smaller things. Once Priscilla was having trouble with her maths at university, and she was going to fail unless she could get a tutor, and they, I guess couldn't afford a tutor. And a man came from Czechoslovakia or Germany or someplace, because they had visitors from all over Europe, and he had a great concern about his wife's spiritual state and didn't know what to do. So he got this counseling from the Schaeffers, and they kind of showed him what could be done, and he realized, oh yeah, I hadn't thought of that. Thank you. This is exactly what I need. And so he, in gratitude, says, is there anything I can do for you? I'll do anything. And they said, no, that's fine. He said, I'm a math teacher. Would that help? So they said, I think if you could speak to our daughter, that would be great. So he tutored her for a couple of weeks and got her through the course. They had prayed about this. This was not just coincidence for them. This was God at work. So reality of prayer. Of course, Schaeffer begins to teach about the Christian life in a way you would expect, which is you can't practice the Christian life truly and honestly unless you're a Christian. I remember at L'Abri, when some of us professed faith, he didn't just say, great, get started, roll your sleeves up. He wanted to be sure you'd taken a step of faith and that you weren't just breathing the lovely mountain air or looking at the flowers. So he had he asked us all 4 questions when somebody had expressed commitment to the gospel before they would acknowledge someone to be a Christian. Number 1, do you believe that God exists and that he is a personal God and that Jesus Christ is God? Remembering that we are not talking of the word or idea God, but of the infinite personal God who is there. That was his favorite way of explaining who God was. He was the infinite personal God who is there. Infinite, of course, in all of his attributes, but personal. And he is there, meaning he's real. He's absolutely not just existent, but he's present. Second, do you acknowledge that you are guilty in the presence of God? Remembering that we are not talking about guilt feelings, but true moral guilt. He always made that distinction. We're not talking about guilt feelings. We're talking about real guilt, objective guilt before God. And that comes up over and over again in his book, True Spirituality. Because there are a lot of people who feel guilty and aren't. Or there are a lot of people who are guilty but don't feel it. And in the psychology around his time, they were always working on guilt feelings without imagining that there could be true guilt. Third, do you believe that Jesus Christ died in space and time in history on the cross, and that when he died, his substitutionary work of bearing God's punishment against sin was fully accomplished and complete? This was right at the center of his theology and of his view of the Christian life. Christ died, and the battle in those days was very much against people who thought the death and resurrection were either mythological or were legends, and he harped on this a lot, and that he died as a substitution for us. There are plenty of good theories of the atonement, Christus Victor, all the others, but this one was the central one for him. And then fourth, on the basis of God's promises in his written communication to us, the Bible, do you or have you cast yourself on this Christ as your personal Savior, not trusting in anything you yourself have ever done or ever will do? He's to talk about lifting up the empty hands of faith and receiving the gift. And here he talks about casting yourself on him. So when you begin your Christian life, if you really are a Christian, then you're ready to take the first steps towards freedom and finding full reality. One of the things he says at the outset is there are two major tests of how we're doing spiritually. And I think both of these have great value. The first test relates to God. And it's very simple. Do I know contentment? If I love God enough to be contented, then I'm being properly spiritual. Now, the opposite of contentment is revolt, which is the essence of sin. And he presents a number of biblical proofs for this contention, particularly Romans 8:28, which he says is not a candy-coated thing when evils face you, but to assure you that even in the midst of terrible suffering, God will bring about the good. In a fallen, abnormal world, can I still believe that the universe is personal and that God has the right to use me in the spiritual battle? And the second test relates to our neighbor. Do I love my neighbor enough not to envy? And he cites a number of manifestations of envy. Do I take secret pleasure at my neighbor's misfortune? Schaeffer insisted that we are all susceptible to this sin. Even in my quest for reality, or for more reality, I can fall into this perversion. And if we're honest, we'll realize that my secret envy still soon spills over from the internal life to the external life. So we can end up actually hating our neighbor and slandering our neighbor out of envy. And he adduces a number of biblical warrants for this test. And so those are the tests. Then he says, important as the negatives of revolt and envy are, or be, they're not the end of the story. The end has to be positive. I need to be in communion with God in this present moment of history. And he stressed throughout the importance of what he called a moment-by-moment practice. Yesterday's victory, yesterday's spirituality is not good enough for today's reality. There's lots more to say here, but does anybody want to interact here or ask questions or follow up? We've got a little more time. Yes, sir. Yeah, it's 3:3. Yeah, the fundamentals of the biblical worldview are the four tests, the fundamentals, and then the two tests, and then I'm going to get to the Ten Commandments. It's actually both. Yeah. Yeah, I guess I could have said more about 3:2, because he does a lot more than these 4 points when he presents the Christian, the worldview. But those are the fundamentals, yeah. So he has these two tests, and then he goes into a section on the Ten Commandments, saying, the Ten Commandments, he says that often at L'Abri, people come in and they complain about legalism. A lot of the students who came were, the way I was, from an agnostic background, unchurched. But they were getting an increasing number from Christian backgrounds, but from perhaps churches which had stressed the law at the expense of the gospel, or had been legalistic in their perception. And so the students, complained about this. And Schaeffer rather agreed with them that legalism is a bad thing. But then he he answered and said, but there's a place for the law. And he was a Calvinist at this point, believed in the third use of the law. And he said that the Ten Commandments are important guides to the Christian life. And he spent a lot of time on the 10th commandment. He said, if you think you're doing pretty well in the first 9, try the 10th, and you'll realize not only are you breaking the 10th, but by breaking the 10th, you're breaking all the others. So he has a long section on how to handle law, which I think is still a very important issue for us. The law can't save us. It will condemn us if we don't have Christ, but it cannot save us. Nevertheless, once we are saved, it's a very important guide for the Christian life, and it puts God's ways before us. He stresses in the book True Spirituality, as well as elsewhere, the reality of Christ's death and resurrection for us, to the point where he says, we are dead to sin, and we are raised to newness of life. He uses Romans 6 a lot, as you can imagine. He says, what we have to do is believe this in our Christian life. And a lot of us don't act as though we believed we were dead to sin. And even less do we act as though we believed we were alive unto righteousness. And so he had some very creative way. One of Schaeffer's, I think, most amazing characteristics is he had very creative and fresh ways of saying old things. And I think it's Colin Duryea, one of his biographers says that one of the fruits of his love for modern art was that modern art is able to look at ordinary things from so many different perspectives, often destructively so, but the point here is that you look at ordinary things and you see things that you wouldn't without the arts. And Schaeffer, I think, did that with his understanding of the Christian life. If we are dead to sin and alive to righteousness by resurrection, life to life, then we need to do what he called possessing our possessions. We need to own that and believe it and reckon ourselves dead to sin and alive unto God. And he stressed that this is what he called an active passivity. One of his favorite episodes in the Bible is where the angel visits Mary and says, you're about to be with a child from the Holy Spirit. And Schaeffer pauses over her response. He said she could have given 2 wrong responses. One would have been, I'm not going to do this, this is not me, I'm not up for it. The other is, he says, that she could say, okay, I'll do it, and I'm ready. I've got the strength, whatever it takes, Lord. And he says these are both wrong, of course. One, to refuse God's will is wrong, and also to say you can do it in your own strength. Instead, he says she said, behold the handmaid of the Lord. And this was an act of active passivity. She's a handmaid, she's a servant. But she had to say, I'll do this. And it's active. And Schaeffer was very strong throughout his ministry on our responsibility, choice-making, the activity of going into the Christian life. But it was never meritorious activity. It was never our works righteousness. It was always the proper kind of passive activity. So he throws that phrase around quite a bit, and it's been very useful to many people to ward off, on the one hand, resistance, on the other hand, works righteousness. He says we need to be the fruitful bride. The fruitful bride is, of course, active, but is passive. So that was a huge ingredient in his approach to the Christian life, and he throughout True Spirituality refers back to that. Another one of his emphases, which has been important to us, to Barbara and me, is he used to say perfectionism is one of the greatest dangers in the church and in the Christian life. He met lots of people who were driven by their own perfectionism or the perfectionism of their parents or of leaders. He used to say, if you want perfection or nothing, you'll get nothing every time. And he said that one of the most often encountered problems in a marriage was perfection or perfectionism. You know, the husband wants his bride to be the most beautiful, the wisest, the greatest servant, and so forth, and she's going to fail him, and he's going to be disillusioned. The wife wants a husband to be the perfect leader, noble, wise, vulnerable, plans the family life perfectly. He's going to fail, and she'll be massively disappointed. And so they want perfection, and they're getting nothing instead of the alternative. What is the alternative? We called it substantial progress. The alternative to perfection or nothing is substantial progress. We can expect growth. Setbacks, yes, but then more reality and real growth can come in over the years. And he was very careful to say, don't try to measure your growth by comparison with someone else, because they're not on the same journey you are. But compare your growth to how you handled a problem a few years before. Maybe you're doing a little better. Like C.S. Lewis, commenting on this, he said, don't judge someone based on how perhaps immature or stunted they seem to be. You don't know how far they've come. This kind of wisdom. He was although people call him an apologist, and he was, of course, he was brilliant. He had a pastor's heart. He had those parishes, and he treated most of us as sheep in his flock, not as objects for persuasion. So he cared about marriages and families and people with standards that were out of line, and he encouraged them that there could be substantial growth. One feature of his view of the Christian life, which surprises some people, is, and the reason it surprises them is because he was always criticizing mysticism. He criticized the existentialist, Karl Jaspers, as he understood him, for searching some irrational final experience. He railed against the charismatic movement. He was very critical. I had a charismatic friend, charismatic pastor friend, who was a great admirer of Francis Schaeffer. And I said, what do you think of his book, The New Super Spirituality? Oh, it's the worst book he ever wrote. He just didn't get it. But Schaeffer was consistent with himself, because what he wanted Christians not to do is to sort of leap up into some upper story where they'd have an experience of the Holy Spirit that set them off from other people. And he reckoned that parts of the charismatic movement did this, right or wrong. That's what he felt. So with this critique of mysticism, it's surprising that throughout, not just True Spirituality, but other writings, he favors the mystical union with Christ. And the difference between true mysticism and irrational mysticism was big for him. He invited us to think that we were to be mystical in our union with Christ. He quoted Calvin, who talks about the mystical union with Christ. And because of that, we have a mystical union with one another in the church. The church is the mystical bond between believers. So he had this sense of a proper mysticism. And if somebody would want to do a careful analytical study of this, it would be worthwhile, because it's not irrational. It's a very rational, it's an active passivity. But it's neither is it a kind of, pure doctrinal, check off the loci type of spirituality. It is really a yielding to the bridegroom. And I don't know, he claims he never had any mystical experiences himself. Once he said something happened that I can't explain, and if you want to call it mysticism, that's fine. But he was, just as a person, I think, constantly living in the heavenlies. One of his favorite stories in the Bible was the Transfiguration. He talked about them going up the mountain, and Christ was glowing, and they beheld this, and embarrassed Peter, didn't know what to do except saying we should build booths. And then they came down, and he used to say, what must the world have looked like when they came down from that mountain? His favorite story was Paul being translated into the third heavens. And, he spent a lot of time on 2 Corinthians 12, and he described Paul going up into this realm, and he says, what did he see? It's unimaginable. It's indescribable. Paul himself says, I can't describe it. And then he says, how gray and dark and ordinary the world that he came back to must have looked after this perspective. And, Schaeffer, I don't want to say this, irreverently, but he had a sort of glow about him at times when I just think he was very much living in the reality of the supernatural. He had plenty of warts and faults, and Frankie Schaeffer is trying to prove to the world that he had more of them than he really did. But he was just an amazing man living in the heavenlies. And so his Christianity is, his view of the Christian life is that it is properly inward. And this was characteristic of all that he taught. He was a strong believer that ideas have consequences, almost to the point of ignoring the reverse, which we now have learned from Peter Berger and others, that consequences also shape ideas. He loved Michelangelo's the creation of Adam in the Sistine Chapel, where God is pictured as an Ancient of Days, and he's just created Adam, and the fingers are nearly touching. And he used to point out, if you look carefully, you can see under his left arm Eve as a kind of shadow, but it's clearly Eve. And Schaeffer would say, God had the idea of Eve before the reality. And he did, of course. He had his counsel. So he stressed the inward nature of the Christian life. And I think having grown up with this movement, which was all about externals, this is a particularly important part for him to stress. And so finally, I've already mentioned prayer. The Schaeffers believed not only in the reality of prayer, but in the reality of prayer as a conduit to God's guidance. They didn't say that what they did in faith and by prayer was for everybody in the same way. They felt they had a special calling, as they said, to demonstrate the existence of God in the 20th century. Sometimes some of us who lived in L'Abri tried it at home, and it wasn't as glorious or easy as we thought it might be. So maybe because we didn't do it very well, but they had constant experiences of answer to prayer as keys to what they should do next. I'll give you one instance, maybe a very well-known one. I told you that they had been kicked out of the Catholic canton of Valais. They were living in a town called Champéry, and they'd led many people to the Lord. They tried to do it as carefully and tactfully as they could, but they still led people to the Lord. And one of them was Monsieur Exhenry, who was the head of the power company. And when the town fathers found out, they got the government to kick them out, which, if you tell a Swiss person that, they say, no, never. This is the most tolerant country in the world. It wasn't then. They prayed about it, of course, and in the prayer it came to Fran that they should go down and check with one of their friends who's in the government. And the friend, sure enough, read the letter, said, this doesn't happen in Switzerland, and then it was official, so maybe it does. And he looked at the fine print, and it says, you have to leave the canton and the country within whatever amount of weeks it was, unless you can purchase property in a Protestant canton. And so Edith particularly was strong in this area. She believed that God wanted them to stay in Switzerland and to minister to these students. And so she starts looking at real estate in the snow, and went around and couldn't find anything right. And they finally found a chalet that looked like it could be the right place. And to make a long story short, she put a bid in on it, and then she prayed that night that if God wanted them to purchase this place, he would send them $1,000 in the next day's mail. That was a lot of money at that time. They wake up, the mail comes, they open the envelopes, and one of them has a letter and a check for $1,000. Plus, the letter was from some friend of theirs in the States saying, I knew I wanted to give you this money, and in the evening, where I was going to decide to give it to you the next day or the day after, I had this urgent sense that you needed it sooner rather than later. So it was in the snow, I put my clothes, my boots back on, walked to the post office to be sure they would get it the first thing, put it in. So the timing was, exactly perfect. And so all the steps that led to the founding of L'Abri were often characterized by these rather dramatic and evident answers to prayer. Schaeffer was very careful to avoid the wrong kind of mysticism and guidance. He once told us that only once did he sense that God was nudging him to do something. Otherwise, he didn't have nudges. He just read the Bible and had convictions. So Edith maybe a little bit more nudging, but he was very careful to avoid a wrong kind of mysticism, as I was mentioning. So these were not kind of people walking into the horizon. They were very rooted and grounded. But they did have this extraordinary sense that if you really pray and really believe it, God will answer. He might answer with a no, or with a yes, or with a wait. But he would always answer. So the title of this is Lessons We Can Learn from Him. Francis Schaeffer was one of many great, great leaders and founders in the church that we can look up to. And he himself would admit that he stood on the shoulders of giants. But he was a giant. As Os Guinness once put it, he cared passionately about truth, passionately about God, and passionately about people. And it was a hard-won passion because he had gone through so many adventures and misadventures, coming up as a pretty tough man who had to wrestle a lot until the passion became real and until he was smitten by the love of God himself. But I can testify that this is who he was. He was full of grace. He loved people, and he literally died with his boots on for his commitment to the truth, to God, and to people. All right, enough of me. Let me hear from some of you. Oh, prescient. How was he prescient? How was Francis Schaeffer prescient about knowing where the church would be? Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. He saw things in trends and trajectories. He saw that the evangelical church in North America was on a very dangerous slope. Thought there were a couple of windows of opportunity. For various reasons, he thought that when Reagan was elected, there might have been a window, but he soon concluded that the church really was headed in the wrong direction. He thought that the church lacked this reality that he talks about. In The Church Before a Watching World and other books, he railed against some of the evangelical churches that had no idea how to be compassionate with a cost. He used to say, the two goals of many evangelical churches are personal peace and affluence. And Then he gives counterexamples of how, if you're comfortable letting people into your home, people who are probably not savory or gonna, might mess you up. At L'Abri, the Schaeffers had all of their wedding gifts lost or broken or destroyed within about a year of their ministry. So he felt the church lacked some of this. He also felt the church lacked the conviction that doctrine mattered, that truth was important. He gave a paper at the Lausanne Conference in 1974 on the need to confess a fully authoritative Bible. So he felt that that was being eroded. I think he thought in terms of trajectories. Some people called him a prophet of doom. I would say that could be, except that he showed many signs of hope, light shining in the darkness, and he quoted examples of Christians who were acting in a very biblical and hopeful sort of way. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I want to comment on how Schaeffer believed that truth affected all of life and not just prayer and piety. In that way, he was the descendant of Abraham Kuyper, probably through his friend Rookmacher, as well as through Cornelius Van Til, under whom he'd studied for 2 years at Westminster Seminary. And then also because of his biblical conviction that all of life belonged to God. And his love for the arts was not to be stymied. When the movement decided to abstain from the so-called liberties, they did that, but Edith was particularly hard put to abstain from dancing because she loved to dance. And she told him when they got married, we're probably going to be missionaries, but I'm not going to dress like a missionary. Whatever that means. Well, dark clothes and hair in the bun. And actually, she did wear her hair in the bun most of the time. But she was not to be put down. So all of life under the lordship of Christ, and he stated it in many different places. One of my favorite places, and here he's really prescient, is Pollution and the Death of Man, a gem of a little book in the late 60s on ecology. He has the two opposite wrong paths to take. The first is technology is going to save us, and the second is, hugging trees, just let it go. And the third way was to take great care of the environment, and he cited many cases. I think the heart of his interest was aesthetic, because I don't know that he'd studied, eco-cycles and that sort of thing, but he knew there was a power plant on the other side of the valley. On a clear day, you could see it in the Dent du Midi, or near the high part of the Swiss Alps, and it was just ugly. It had pipes going up and smoke billowing, and he said, "This is a better way to do this. It's more costly to do it in a different way, but in the end, it's better because it doesn't destroy the environment." So he really did believe that truth applies to every area of life. It's magnificent. That was one of the things that attracted us when we went up there. I didn't say this. I'll say it now. He had a way, both Edith and Fran had a way of affirming people. "Oh, you're a music major. Wow, tell me that. Would you mind playing the piano tonight?" And, it wasn't about, okay, where does, the Bible fit into your music? And it was, it wasn't cautious. It was, he believed the Bible, but they wanted to affirm people and love them, and they started arts festivals and things like that. And, they took very seriously the idea that mankind as God's image meant that there was a lot of integrity and beauty still left in people, even though they were flawed and sinful. Yeah, I think you're right that many of the L'Abris are in more remote places like the Orchard or high up in the Swiss Alps. There are some exceptions to that. There's a Dutch Labrie work in is it Utrecht? Where is it? And there's one in Sydney. There was one in Ealing, which is in the heart of London or East London. So there's exceptions, but you're right, and the answer to your question is basically word of mouth. You know, there's this cool place you should go to. One of my friends who ended up in Labrie, he was on the Kathmandu Trail, and he was, you know, exploring in the Himalayas. He met Timothy Leary there and everything. And someone told him, there's this amazing place, and you get free food, and the girls are really beautiful. And he went and became a believer, and he's now a very effective missionary. The other way would, two other ways. One is Dr. Schaeffer in those days lectured in all these universities. He was a regular at Oxford and Cambridge, came to Harvard often. And some of our friends, some of them are actually here, who met him in Cambridge in those days. Remember, he would not only lecture in public, but come up to the rooms later and talk late into the night with them. Randall Macaulay, Ian Cooper, many of those friends who now are involved with Christian Heritage had this experience. And then the other thing was the media. He wrote books. He made movies, not very good ones, but he was able to communicate through some of these media. And I have met, you meet people today who say, I never met Francis Schaeffer. I was a floundering student. I picked up one of his books, changed my life. Or you meet people who say, you know, I picked up the book, it changed my life, so I had to go to this place and spent, you know, months there and did meet him. So those were some of the typical ways, and strange ways. There was an army base in Stuttgart or someplace, and the word had gotten around to the soldiers that there was this place where you could get spiritual help. And so they had all these U.S. Army people coming to Labrie. And I made the remark earlier that some of his thought hasn't been fully explored. What would I recommend? Well, I do recommend that his apologetics be more fully explored, even than Brian Follis did, because, and this is a hard task, because it wasn't systematically careful the way you'd find in Van Til or even Os Guinness or John Frame. So you'd have to not only cull from all the books, but listen to hours of lectures, because that's where or discussions, you know, that's where you really find out what matters to him. And also a careful study would correct some of his critics who rightly saw the carelessness of some statements that pushed them farther than they're meant to be pushed. You know, just give you a minor example. He had an interesting mixture of the coherentist view of truth and the imitation view of truth. And he made a statement in one of his books that truth is in two parts. It has to be consistent, and you have to be able to live with it. Now, not truth, proof is in two parts. It's got to be consistent, and you've got to be able to live with it. Well, I think there's something very important about that statement, but a careful philosophical look at the consistency thing, the coherency thing, could poke a hole in it. There are lots of consistent or coherent truths, and people who live pretty well with them. You know, Stalinism was coherent. Stalin, you know, went pretty far. However, Schaeffer, I think, is onto something there, because no one can successfully live within a system that isn't fully reconciled to reality. Nobody. He may not have found the flaw in Stalin, but there surely had to have been one. So the more careful look at that, his method of proof, his use of evidence, his use of presuppositions, I think that's a work to be done. And then somebody ought to write a book on his view of the Christian life. made an attempt. It's going to be published in September. But as I think about it and read it again, it's really not complete enough. One more. Sure, I'll talk about the book. Go ahead first. Yeah, do I see anything that would anticipate the postmodern? Yeah, absolutely. I think much of his concern about the giving up of absolutes, while it was the beginnings of the kind of crisis of the 20th century, still in a very modern context, I think anticipated brilliantly the postmodern irrationalism, mix and match religions, contradictions, and we talk about fragmentation in the arts and things like that. So, yeah, I think it's all over the place. I don't think he used the term. That's very good. Yeah, that's a very important point. It could be a inspiration for future work on him. Yeah, how Francis, I could see the article, how Francis Schaeffer anticipated postmodernism. Why don't you write it? Yeah, I just, an outfit called Crossway Good News is doing a series on, I don't know, 10 people maybe, or 12 Christian leaders, Luther, Calvin, Warfield, Bonhoeffer, and their views of the Christian life. So they asked me if I'd do the Schaeffer one. So at first I said no. But Justin Taylor has a way of twisting your arm. It's a pretty simple book. I give opening remarks about his life story. And then I concentrate heavily on true spirituality. And then his views of the church, his views of prayer and guidance, and then finally his approach to the fact that all life is under the lordship of Christ and that spirituality isn't just a narrow prayer thing.